Hello, Gloria Day, women of the ELCA members. I'm Pastor Mike. It's great to be with you again after a few months of being away. And I'm looking forward to sharing with you some thoughts about our next Bible study, which is from the November issue of the Gather magazine. And the Bible study is entitled Holy Time. It's session 3, and the subtitle is Holy Future, Reimagining the Time to Come. I'm in the section marked Introduction, and I noticed some things there that caught my eye. It mentions in there how God is present with us in all times of our lives, past, present, and future. And that's really the great promise of the scriptures, is that in all times, in all places, God is with us. You've perhaps heard me mention it before, but I'll mention it again. In Psalm 23, famous psalm, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. If you take the words to Psalm 23 in the original Hebrew language and lay them out end to end, and if you start chopping off one word from the front and one word from the back and just keep working your way to the center, what you'll find, and this works almost the same way in English too, by the way, what you'll find is that the very central words to Psalm 23 are the words, "For thou art with me." Again, central to Psalm 23, central to the Bible, central to our Christian faith, that God is with us at all times. And today, in this Bible study, we are going to focus specifically on how God is with us as we journey into the future. I'll stop here and we will continue on with the next section shortly. All right, we are continuing now on page 18 in the section entitled, We Plant, Our Children Eat. In this section, there is some words and stories about a young adult named Olivia. She's a Palestinian Lutheran, and she talks about planting some small trees and that they will eventually bear fruit, but it mentions that it takes 10 to 20 years. And then she has these very profound words. The question would be, why would you be willing to wait that long? Olivia said simply this, we plant, our children eat. And I was thinking how those words have really rung true in my life. I was thinking about, like, for instance, I grew up in Gaylord, Minnesota. Well, guess what? Gaylord, Minnesota just didn't appear on the prairie one day. The town was carefully planned and laid out and built by people who went before me. They planted. I was able to eat. School I went to, same story. I went to the school and there it was, but it didn't just, again, appear out of nowhere. Some very faithful people, predecessors to me in the town of Gaylord, who felt that education was very important, planted a school. They built that school. So that kids like me, I started kindergarten in the fall of 1970. School was built, I believe, in the early 1930s. Okay, they built that school so that children like me could, quote unquote, eat. The church I went to, St. Michael's Catholic Church in Gaylord. Again, same story there. Some committed Christian people got together and they planted a church. I went to that church for all of my school years. Again, it didn't just appear out of nowhere. They planted, I was able to eat. When it was time for me, after my high school years were over, to head off to college, much to my delight, I found out that my grandmother and my parents both had been saving money for me so that I could go to college. Now, the money that they had saved did not pay for all of my college, But suffice it to say, it was enough where it could easily have gone for a nice new car or something for themselves, but they invested in me. They planted so that I could eat, educationally speaking. And I'm so grateful for that. So again, this idea that is expressed in that little phrase, we plant, our children eat, is because we have hope for the future. When you plant something, you don't get to eat the fruits of it right away. You plant it in the hopes that there will be a harvest in the future. And we know as Christian people that what we plant today will indeed come to fruition with God's help. I was thinking about this in terms of churches, in particular Gloria Dei Lutheran Church. You know, part of what we are called to do is to plant so that future children may eat. We need to leave a legacy at Gloria Dei so that future generations can continue the great work that Gloria Dei is about. And one of the things that can actually work against that, if we're not careful, is that we can fall into the trap of focusing too much on what we older adults want versus what the younger generations want. And I've seen this happen. In my first call, I served 2 churches, and one of the little churches that I served, quite frankly, they only did hymns, they only engaged in traditions and the like that the older members liked and wanted. Those older members didn't really seem to care that much what the younger generations might find useful and helpful to them. And I'm sad to report that what happened was the younger generations simply disappeared on them. And in the year 2014, that little church had to close. It no longer exists because the older adults, quite honestly, forgot that they needed to plant so that the future generations may eat. And I would hate to see anything like that ever happen to a magnificent church like Gloria Dei. So it's something I think for us all to think about. I just celebrated a birthday. I'm 56 years old now. And again, I, of course, have my wants and my likes and those kinds of things. But the church is finally not all about me. I need to remember that part of my calling as one of the older members of the church is to plant so that future children may eat. If you'll continue with me over to page 19, the second full paragraph has just a treasure load of some things to think about. I underlined these words, the second sentence of that second paragraph. The future is at the very heart of God's promises, because promises by definition deal with things that are not yet, but will be. And I got to thinking about how true those words are about promises. I remember one of the promises that my father made to me and my brothers a lot was the promise that he would take us to Minnesota Twins baseball games. And we knew that our father was a big baseball fan. In fact, he was the high school baseball head coach. And so when our father would make that promise, we knew that we probably weren't going to the game that day, but we knew that within a matter of days or weeks, we would get to go to Old Metropolitan Stadium. And sure enough, those promises, more often than not, came true. Also, a little bit further down in that same paragraph, reminds us of some words of Jesus from Matthew 6:34, where Jesus encouraged us not to worry about tomorrow. And then a little bit later, I underlined these words. It says, Jesus is not telling us to forget about tomorrow or ignore the future. Rather, Jesus is giving us a foundation for facing the future. And then a little bit further down, it says, we are freed by the gospel not to worry about the future, because we know that Jesus died, was buried, and rose again, thereby ensuring us with 100% certainty that our hope in him is not misplaced, that there is indeed a glorious future that awaits us. And so when we think about the future, we do so with great, great hope and anticipation because of Jesus. Finally, the last paragraph in this section says, this month's study will keep in mind how the Bible's perspective on the future both comforts us and calls us. So the Bible wants to assure us that our future is safe and secure in Christ. But at the same time, it wants to call us. It wants to challenge us. It wants us to realize that we get to share in part in shaping the future. God invites us to help shape that glorious future that we know is coming. So again, it's comforting and a bit of a challenge, a bit of a calling. I'm going to stop here. I'll invite you to take a look at the beginning of the next section to do the Bible readings and look at the question, and then we will continue with that next section. All right. I am now in the section on page 19 entitled, It Shall Not Return to Me Empty, A Future of Hope. And if you did the Bible reading, there is some Bible reading from the book of Isaiah, chapter 55, and also from Luke's Gospel, chapter 1. And I would say if you have not done that Bible reading, I'd really encourage you maybe to pause this video and go do that. Because what I'm going to say next will make a lot more sense if you've read those passages, okay? All right. Let's talk first about the passage from Isaiah. Isaiah writes about this amazing feast of abundance that will take place, an everlasting covenant between God and the people. It will not only be for the people of Israel, it will be for people from literally every corner of the globe. And the mountains, the hills will burst into song. The trees of the field will clap their hands in praise, and just on and on and on it goes about this amazing free feast. And what's so just astonishing about this passage is that it was written during one of the bleakest, darkest, most horrible times in the nation of Israel's history. What had happened was roughly about 600 years before Jesus was born, the nation of Israel was conquered by the Babylonians. The Babylonians would be like today, the people who live in the modern day country of Iraq. And what the Babylonians did was they took huge swaths of the population of Israel and took them back to Babylon to serve as slaves. And not only that, just for good measure, they just utterly laid waste to and destroyed the capital city of Jerusalem. They took apart the temple, just absolutely blew it up to smithereens, and just left Jerusalem in complete ruin. So here are these people, they're slaves in Babylon. They know that their capital city lays in complete ruin. And along comes Isaiah writing these words of this amazing time to come. This wonderful feast where, again, everybody from all over the planet Earth will come and join in it. And of course, it had to be bewildering to the people to hear this, because it's not easy to hear words of hope when your situation isn't very good. When your life is easy, as it says in the last full paragraph on the bottom of page 19, it says, when your life is easy, it's not difficult to be optimistic. And I thought, boy, is that true, right? Like if you're watching a football game and your favorite team is ahead in that game 30-0, it's pretty easy for you to be optimistic and hopeful that pretty good chance here our team's going to win. Put yourself on the other side of that. Your team's behind 30-0. Pretty difficult to stop and think that there's any hope. Well, that's where the Israelites were. They were in a position where it was tough to believe that there was any hope for the future, being slaves in a faraway land, knowing that the land they came from had been pretty much utterly destroyed. Then we move on to from Luke chapter 1. Mary finds out she's going to have a baby, and she issues a proclamation, and she says words that are images of a world where life is finally fair for the poor and the marginalized, where the world will finally be at peace. Again, her world was anything but that. The land of Israel at that time was occupied by a foreign power, the Romans. And it didn't look like there was ever any hope that things would change. Romans were not good to the local people, and it just seemed, dare I say, hopeless. Mary speaks of this time to come that's so full of hope. And one of the things that's really interesting, it's noted in the study, she speaks as though these things have already happened. She talks about them like they're already done. None of them actually were yet, but she speaks about them, in past tense, as if they are done, they are completed. And you wonder, how could she be so confident that these things were going to happen? And the answer is, of course, her confidence comes from that child within her, the baby Jesus. She knew that this special child she'd been asked to carry would bring about these things. And of course, as we know, he did. On the top of page 20, on the right-hand column, that first paragraph, you don't get the full paragraph, it actually begins in the previous column. But in that first paragraph, I underlined something that I think is really crucial. It says, we are not yet what we shall be, but we are growing toward it. These are the words of Martin Luther, actually. We are not yet what we shall be. And I especially doubly underlined that word shall. Because Luther also speaks with confidence, with great hope for the future. He says, we are not yet what we shall be. He doesn't say, we are not yet what we might be. No. He says, what we shall be. We shall be. We have confident hope of what we shall be. Why do we have that kind of confident hope? Why did Mary have that kind of confident hope? Why did Isaiah have that kind of confident hope? Because our hope is in God. And God is a God whose word never comes back to him empty. It always accomplishes what God set it out to do. And so we live with that kind of confidence, knowing that God has spoken words of promise to you and me. And what God says shall be, shall be. All right, I'm going to invite you to go ahead to the next section. There's a little more reading you need to do and a question or two to look at. And we will continue shortly with that next section. I am now on the bottom of page 20 with the section entitled Oil Lamps and High Beams. Turn to page 21. The very first paragraph talks about a couple of verses from the readings you would have done. One is from verse 105 of Psalm 119, where the psalmist writes, to the Lord, thy word is a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path. And then Paul in 1 Corinthians 13 writes, now we see in a mirror dimly. And goes on to talk about how there was this seminary professor that found like actual lamps that would have been used back in the day of the writing of this psalm. And noted that, of course, they're not the high-powered flashlights and such that we have today. They were just little lamps, and they really only provided about enough light to just see a little ways. And it goes on here, and I think I underlined this in the second paragraph on the left-hand column of 21. I underlined where it says, God's word gives us just enough light to see the next step in front of us, but no more. And I think that's been so true in my life. I imagine you found that to be true in your life. We never get to see what the next 20 years have in store. We really maybe only get to see a glimpse, maybe a day or a week, but usually not much more than that. And my goodness, if we haven't learned anything from the year 2020, right? It's that just when you think you can see way into the future, wow, things can change pretty quickly. But yet God gives us enough light for today, enough light for us to continue to make that next step of faith. In that third paragraph, left column 21, I underlined this. If we knew everything that would happen ahead of time, we would have no need for trust. We would have no opportunity for joy, and we would have no freedom to choose and to grow. And really, that is so key to our lives as God's people, as Christian people. We need to trust. We need opportunity for joy. And we desperately need the opportunity to choose and to grow. So again, not knowing all the specifics of the future is not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, it's part of what makes life delightful, part of that joy of the unexpected. So again, as we move forward, we realize in the future, yes, we know God will be there. Yes, we know our future is ultimately secure. But no, we don't know every specific detail. And that's by design. God's word will light the way. Our job is to have faith enough to make the very next step. All right, we're going to end this section. I'll invite you to look at the next section to read the Bible reading and reflect on the two questions there, and we will continue shortly. I am now in the section entitled, The Future is Now Remaking the World, on page 21. And I want to begin by saying that one of the great pet peeves I have, and maybe this happened to you, I'm guessing it probably has, is to be with someone and you're working on some kind of a project of some sort. You're doing something together, whether it's raking leaves or baking something or whatever it is you happen to be doing. And I just despise it when the person says to me, good enough, when I know that it's not good enough. I mean, it's one thing if it actually is good enough, but I hate that when somebody says, good enough, and I know right to the bone marrow that this is not good enough. We should stay at this longer. We could do this so much better. And this section is kind of talking about that with regard to this idea of remaking the world. Again, I find as I get older that I'm settling too much now with certain things. And what I mean by that is that I'm saying, good enough, when maybe that's really not true. And one of the people I've been very inspired by is mentioned here in this article, this little girl named Greta Thunberg, who is very, very interested in preserving the earth, and particularly with the dangers presented by climate change. And she said something that I highlighted in the very last paragraph on page 21. She said, while many older adults have the relative luxury of knowing that the worst effects of climate change will come after their lives are over, young people can expect to live through them. What Greta Thunberg is saying to those of us that are a little further along the age spectrum, the way we're taking care of planet Earth is not good enough. It's not good enough. And if you flip over to page 22, the first full paragraph, I underlined these words. If God is preparing a new heaven and a new earth, does it really matter what happens to this one? Does it really matter what happens to this earth if God is preparing a new heaven and a new earth? But you know what? That is a dangerous misreading of the Bible, actually. If you go into that next big paragraph, about halfway through it, it notes correctly that the holy city, the New Jerusalem, is seen coming down out of heaven from God. Okay? The future, as it says just a few sentences later, the future is not a world abandoned by God, but a world made new by God. God's future takes place not in heaven, but on earth. I think that's so important for us to recognize. I think sometimes we think that, well, here I am on planet Earth. Someday I'll be leaving here and heading off to heaven. And therefore, I don't need to care at all about this place that I'm currently at. Well, God's future very much includes this place that we are currently at. The New Jerusalem is coming down out of heaven from God to earth. So this place matters dearly. And it's our only home. If we're not careful, our lives could be cut quite short by our not taking care of it. And those future generations, we talked about earlier, how the parents plant and the children eat. We better be careful about that, because what we're planting with a lot of the poisons and things we continue to kick into our atmosphere and into our existing ecosystems could haunt future generations for years and years, make their lives very miserable. So again, what we do here, remaking this earth, matters greatly. And on the top of the second column of page 22, that first piece of a paragraph, I underlined these words. Christ's body on earth has always existed to bring about the kingdom of God, to participate in God's work of making all things new. You know, when I was a kid growing up, I was a Cub Scout. And one of our mottos when we would do anything outdoors was to leave wherever we were at better than the way we found it. So like sometimes we would maybe get to make a campfire or something. Well, we weren't just to leave, everything a big mess and candy wrappers laying around and all that. We were to actually leave that spot better than the way we found it. And I wonder sometimes if we all took that attitude towards this beautiful earth God has created for us, if we might find that so many of our problems might at least be lessened, if not go away altogether, if we would leave this earth better than the way we found it. And I'm not only talking about it from an ecological standpoint, I'm talking about it from a relational standpoint. I'm talking about it from literally every standpoint that you can think of. We are called, as we journey into that future that we know is secure because of the work of Jesus Christ when he was here with us. So we know the future is secure, but we can help shape that glorious future that is coming And one of the ways we can do that is by leaving this place better than we found it. I underlined the very last sentence on page 22, bottom right, where they noted that there was a sign above the sanctuary exit in the author's home church. And I love that sign. It says, "The worship has ended. Let the service begin." The worship has ended. Let the service begin. You and I are called to service. We are called to make things better in the future, working alongside of God and not in opposition to God. So that's a big challenge. But while we still have breath, all of us, I think we can do and should do even better than we're doing now. So that'd be my challenge to all of us, definitely to myself included. All right, we're going to end this section. I'll invite you to look at the next section. Again, there's one more reading you need to do and a couple more questions you need to take a look at. Okay, I'm on page 23. The section is entitled Planting God's Future to the End of the Age. And the reading from Matthew's Gospel that you will have done is talking about when Jesus gave what is known as the Great Commission. He met with the disciples. He had been raised from the dead, but he had not yet ascended to heaven. So he met with the disciples on a mountain in Galilee. And it says this in Matthew 28, verse 17. And it's, in my opinion, kind of humorous. They worshiped him, but some doubted, it says. Some doubted. And I'm reading that thinking, well, what additional proof did they need exactly from Jesus in that situation? You know, seeing him standing there risen. I mean, goodness sakes, there he is. He's right there talking to them. Where does the doubt come from? But, you know, isn't that funny? That's how our brains work sometimes, is we can have almost incontrovertible proof about something, and yet sometimes our brains just aren't quite there. And that was true of the disciples. But Jesus says, basically, remember, I am with you always to the end of the age. Okay, so as we venture into that future, we have a promise from the risen Jesus that yes, he's ascending to heaven, but no, he is not going to leave us orphaned. I will be with you, he says, to the end of the age. And as we travel into the future, friends, one of the things that is so wonderful about being a person of faith is spelled out very well in the last full paragraph in the left column there on page 23. It says, we do not have to remember God or recognize God or make our way toward God in order for God to be present with us. Okay, so even as we're traveling, even if we have those moments where we're just not really focusing on God at all, and not, as the author says here, remembering God, or maybe we have situations that crop up and things happen, but in the midst of those things that happen, we don't recognize God's fingerprints in it. Or maybe at times we see God, but we're too stubborn or just too weighed down or whatever to make our way toward God. And the author reminds us that even in those failings, God says, I will be with you. We don't have to have accomplished any of those things for God to be present with us. As it says, God was, God is, and God will be. This is grace. And that is so true. That is grace. Because God doesn't owe it to us. We haven't exactly proven ourselves 100% worthy to have God travel with us into the future. But God's grace, God's kindness, God's love, God's mercy, God's forgiveness, all of the best and most wonderful traits of God travel with us because God travels with us. And so, dear friends, as we make our way into the future, and right now, isn't that future perhaps more scary than any other future we've faced with this COVID pandemic, with the economic uncertainties that lie ahead, with this contested election going on, all of these things? It's so easy to be afraid. It's so easy to have our hope dampened. And yet God says, I will be with you. Again, as Psalm 23 reminds us, for thou art with me. Again, I invite you to ponder that great and wonderful mystery of how that is exactly, that a loving God would choose and delight in journeying with us. And then, my friends, celebrate that presence of God each and every step of the way. God's blessings to you as you do this Bible study, and I will look forward in the future to being with you in some of the upcoming Bible studies. Take care. Have a very happy and blessed Thanksgiving. And I may not even be doing the December one. That might be Pastor Marla. So if you don't get a chance to see me before then, I wish you the most Merry Christmas and a most blessed and happy New Year. Take care.